This presentation is called Pissing Down the Leg of Much of Our Collective Careers. Why are you people still buying firewalls and IPS technologies? Or as the file itself has been called, Firewall and IPS Suckfest. I want to give just a little context into this talk today. I've been involved with security over 20 years. 15 of that was as a part of the IDS IPS industry, so a lot of my experience had to do with, of course, building and supplying those products with security content. 6 years of that was development in both C and regular expressions. You might be asking yourself, C, yes, writing parsers, state machines, that sort of thing. I was a part of ISSX Force for 12 years, and I ran DV Labs and ZDI, and I now am the director for ACERT at Arbor Networks.
I'm Elizabeth Martin. I've been in security about 17 years. So my first job out of college was creating a process for firewall change control management. So I was all knee-deep in firewalls. So I would say my first skills are firewalls and networking, but truly my first love was the IDS. Picking apart packets at the time was the love of my life, and that had led me to the rest of my career in professional services. So Dan and I've been in professional services now about, I think, 13 years. So a little background, Dan and I used to work together, and while he was actually writing signatures, I was deploying the products out in the field and using the products in a production environment.
So Elizabeth mentioned we worked together. We actually didn't. We worked at the same company and actually didn't know each other at all. We've only been friends now for 3 years. The reason why we're doing this is because we'd like to provide you all with not just a bash fest. We all know we can do that. Certainly when we've worked with the technology, it's easy to pick on it. But what we do want to do is give you two different views and our experiences along this fairly long career in this industry and with these particular technologies. I want to give a few disclaimers. We do have quite a few friends in this industry. We're not trying to while a good portion of this is bashing the technology, it's also meant to, again, provide you experiences and get you thinking, all right? If you leave this and think, oh, I want to hear a response from my vendor, you shouldn't do that. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't bother. Your vendors already know these issues. There is no original research presented in this. Anything that we show you in terms of evasions is easily Googleable. You can look up any of this stuff yourself, so there's nothing new here. We're going to give some ideas to where things, of course, don't work and do work. Each one of these technologies, I can tell you, were built from the ground up completely differently. One of the common misconceptions, especially with, say, IDS, IPS, is you might know Snort, therefore you think, well, they're all the same. None of them are the same. Whether you're talking open source or commercial, not all of them are Snort. They are quite different. If you asked me a particular vendor or even open source, I would tell you, it's good at this, it's not so good at this. They all have their strengths and weak points.
So there's good, the bad, and the ugly with each one of the technologies and products, right? So certain products work well at certain things, and other products, competing products, work better at other things. But one point I want to sort of make is there's a lot of claims out there, right? So many vendors make many claims, many resellers make many claims, integrators, etc. Some of those claims are true, and some of them are not necessarily. So, and what I see most often in my field, in my line of work, is integrators or resellers that don't truly have an understanding of security and sort of maybe overselling these technologies, which I think is a large part in what's creating, an environment where people don't truly understand what the products and technologies should be doing. So that's kind of the good and bad and ugly.
So why might you all buy these security products? And this is just a small list in our experience. You could probably add more to it, but there's, of course, the feature set. Is the GUI pretty? How's the UX? Management. One of the most important things, can the product produce pretty reports that you can give management? That is, unfortunately, a gigantic one I've seen. The RFP responses that come back, what you hear from analysts, perhaps what you've used before in the past, and of course, a lot of it comes down to price.
And also, in regards to features, there's each one of my clients, I talk to a wide variety of clients on a weekly basis, and with each individual product and technology, everybody wants something different. And honestly, what I see most often is that people actually want a technology or a product that will compensate for a failure they've seen in a previous product. So they get a little bit of a tunnel vision when they're picking their product. They just want to make sure it does this one thing that the last product didn't do.
So in regards to analysts, this is something that the vendors have to deal with. They generally have to pay for these analyst relationships. You might have different stock in these analysts, but buying decisions are absolutely made based on analyst opinion. And the thing you have to realize with analysts is that a lot of their analysis is not based on the product or the technology at all, but based on the business, where the vendor is in the market, what is their vision, these sorts of things. It's not necessarily does the technology work or not, or what the feature set is, or does it actually do anything. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. And then of course you do have companies out there that attempt to be the consumer reports of the industry, NSS Labs, ICSA, SC Magazine, does these sort of reviews, right? So there are, none of these are perfect, but you have to look at a lot of different criteria.
So I think predominantly a large portion of purchasing decisions are made by relationships, right? So there's a lot of different relationships. I pick our products to partner with. Honestly, at this point, maybe I'm a little jaded, but I focus more on business and sort of how they run their sales organizations and sort of the professionalism. But we see a lot. Every day we see CISOs or directors of security or CIOs picking products because they have a relationship with this reseller, and that's the only product that particular reseller partners with within that technology. Or maybe you have friends and buddies. Maybe you have a go-to guy and say, hey, what are you using for blah? And if your buddy likes it and thinks it's okay, you kind of go with it. So I think that relationships actually have a significant influence, possibly more significant than the technology.
One thing to mention on testing, I would certainly recommend that you always do a proof of concept if you can over taking a third party. I know everyone likes to have a third party opinion. You don't want to take what a vendor is saying on their data sheet to be fact. But your own proof of concept is certainly going to be more valuable than a third party. And if you are looking at third party, make sure you actually take into account what their testing criteria is, right? Everything is judgment based on a certain criteria. If you only look at the judgment and not how they actually did the test, it's kind of moot.
And be wary of the false sense of security. So if you have a reseller or integrator that tells you this is all you need, then I would question that. So how do most organizations pick these products? On an average week, I would say I talk to somewhere about 5 to 10 different clients within a week, ranging from 500 employees to the Fortune 500. So what I see most often, I see scenario number one, clients that we've been talking to for 2 years that have done nothing in security, and they call us and they say, all right, this year we're doing security for reals, I swear. I have $50,000, what should I buy? And so we kind of go through the process and help them figure out what to buy. Second scenario is the CIO marches into the CISO's office and says, these audits are killing me, go buy an IDS. And the CISO says, well, but we don't have any people to manage it. Well, I don't care, go buy it. We need the FFIEC off our back. Well, but we don't have the skills in-house. Just go do it. So that's a second scenario. And then the third scenario is they don't really know that they're buying IDS or some type of monitoring technology. They just call us and say, why do I keep getting infected? I have this firewall, and why are all the attacks getting through? And so that kind of leads us down that path of increasing monitoring. So how do I pick products for my clients when I'm helping them? What's going to work? So essentially, I need to look at the threats and the pain points, and I figure out what will actually be the most effective.
So you're wanting, of course, to stop the threats. You have to first ask yourself, all right, not what technology should I be buying, but what problems, of course, am I trying to solve? And this is where we segue into picking on firewalls, because a couple years ago at a mobile conference in New York, made the statement that I didn't think firewalls were security. Why? Because I look at security as being threat-centric. Now, a lot of people moaned and hissed and booed, and many of you might disagree as well, but let me tell you what I'm thinking about here. So the security industry has always used these ridiculous house analogies. And so if we're going to do that, I look at the firewall as the front door, right? You can open it, and it allows access. This might look familiar. This is 10 Downing in London, England, one of the most famous addresses in the world. And I can assure you there's a whole lot more protecting 10 Downing than just the front door, all right? So I look at firewalls more like a saloon door. Right? We know there's tons of access. People walk in and out all the time. So I think that's a better analogy. Now, of course, we learn here every year from Schuyler Town that this is real security. Locks are security. Doors, I question that. All right, but you can add more than just your locks. Of course, you can add dogs, which I think are fantastic. One of the greatest things that have ever happened to mankind. Dogs are pretty neat because, of course, you can use them to let you know if perhaps a stranger is at the door, similar to your IDS. You can also train them to sniff your bags, like airport dogs, right? Let's liken that to maybe content security. And you can, of course, also unleash them on the perpetrator. And so that's also a very nice way to help mitigate. So pretty useful security. Then, of course, I think you've got the original and hackback, the gun, which, of course, Elizabeth is from Chicago, so she doesn't get to have this. But in Texas, this is used quite effectively as a hackback technique. So perhaps a better analogy is not the house, but all the various ways that you would seriously defend a compound with all the various accoutrements that you can have in security, not just simple doors and windows. All right, so continuing to pick on firewalls. We kind of feel like we put ourselves in this position, right? We all said, well, we have these 65,000 fantastic ports back in the day when we could look at Etsy services and know what applications were running. And then we said, well, you need to cut all those off, right? If you diminish the attack surface because you have fewer ports, well, then surely we'll all be more secure. Well, not so much, right? Now we operate over mainly 3 ports, 8443, 53, that sort of thing. And we're worse than ever. So what are those firewalls doing?
Nice job for all of us. 15, 20 years ago when we were all saying everything had to go over 80 and 443, we got it. We're there. Great. So now all the attacks are coming over 80 and 443.
So the answer you hear from the firewall vendors, of course, is buy more firewalls. Now they're just called next generation, or as many people call them, now generation. So now that we're all running over the same ports, now, of course, you need to be able to do deep packet inspection to be able to pull all the applications out of those ports. All right. So I guess that's the answer that we, or the problem that we created. Still not sure that that makes so much sense. So let's look at some of the problems that firewalls actually introduce. Because, of course, the idea is you buy security technology and it should be solving problems, not creating problems. But it does. We, of course, have the CIA, or as Steve Warby called it earlier, the AIC. And firewalls actually introduce issues. While they might help with confidentiality or integrity, they actually can cause availability issues. Right?
And actually, I want to jump in and say that I've decided that I'm taking the A out of the CIA. So I don't really care about availability anymore. I've got 99 problems, and availability ain't one of them. It's just not my problem. But Dan tends to care a little bit more about availability, so I'll let him go ahead and talk about it just this time.
Which is actually the issue. We are so wrapped up with confidentiality and integrity that we oftentimes forget about the availability. And what did the CNI matter if, of course, you're not even online or the asset isn't even available, right? So this is a very common issue in the industry. And I will tell you that I think these only become intersected and closer as time progresses. Even some of the attacks against availability are now intertwined with other types of attacks, many times application level. So let's look just real quick. What does, of course, stateful mean? Well, all stateful means is that you are tracking a connection for validity and that you are tracking that it is an active connection, right? So stateful was a great idea before you, of course, had botnets. Now that you have botnets, of course, state can then create a problem because every single device on your network leading up to your business critical asset is a potential bottleneck for an availability issue, right? That's how DDoS works, right? So there's many other ways that you can do this. Of course, ACLs work great. You can put these in your routers, switches. You might say, oh, well, then, I have management issues. No, in modern routers and switches, there's certainly ways you can do the management. So there's ways around this. Firewall is certainly not your own answer. And you might be saying, oh, well, that's, of course, all fine and dandy, but I don't really think that's an issue. Well, Arbor actually does a report each year called the Worldwide Infrastructure Security Report, where we ask all of our customers, what was their experience with DDoS? And as you can see, over half of them had issues with their firewalls and IPS falling down before the application server or the application itself fell down, right? So these certainly do introduce availability issues. All right, so now that we picked on firewall, let's move on to IDS and IPS, which is actually even more fun. IPS has the problem even worse, way worse, because you're doing serious deep packet inspection with IPS. You're having to do all your TCP reordering. You've got multiple packets that are out of order. You've got serious deep parsing of the big protocols, of course, that we all work over, things like HTTP. Regardless of whether you're using a regular expression as your signature, the parsing for that regular expression to work is requiring some serious parsing to get to that point. Think of all the encoding you have to deal with around the world. UTF-8, UTF-16. There's tons of stuff that an IPS has to worry about just to get to the point where they can actually match your signature, right? That's the whole point of evasion testing against IDS and IPS. And there's a tons of it. You can go back a dozen years with the Whisker tool. It's been around for a very long time and is only getting worse. So a quick review here. Gartner likes to say, the threat landscape changes every 5, 6, 7 years. I would tend to agree. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, right, we had nice, very clean network issues. This is, I would say, when firewalls and IPS actually worked. Slammer, IPS worked great at stopping. All the worms could be effectively mitigated, quite well, actually. The problem is the last worm any of us saw was in November of 2008 with Conficker. And that was a pretty latecomer, right? So the issue is, and this is really, I think, where IDS, IPS died, and firewalls essentially with it, is when everything moved to content. You had botnets were extremely distributed, all right? A signature can't track anything that's distributed. And everything moved to the application level, right? Everything we access is through our web browser. It's even more so now that the cloud is here. Java, Docs, Excel, right? All the various issues that we have to deal with. Of course, anything Adobe. And now, of course, we have all sorts of various aspects that now come along with the multitude of these threats with various motivations, which, of course, signatures have no context or ability to match, right? They don't know whether you're from Russia or China or what matters, or when, or why. Which is kind of the point, right? That's why they increasingly match against things that don't matter, right? You have high false positives, or you have high false negatives, and to be honest with you, you probably have high both. And it's very difficult to measure. We would say probably the most difficult part is the fact that no one is measuring it. So I'm embarrassed to use this picture, because I know everybody's used it since the dawn of time. But it is a pretty good analogy for what attackers do, right? They understand you have firewalls, they understand you have IPS, they understand you have AV, right? You actually put it in your compliance. They can read PCI standards just like you can. So they know what they have to work around, and that's exactly what they do. So let's look at a couple examples here. JavaScript. This was probably one of the largest banes of my existence as a signature writer. This is a very easy and simple example. You can see that there's a simple function here. The alert function in JavaScript is how you pop up the little box, right? So that's why we see a box here. And you can see they're simply converting a numeric string to text, in this case, beef. Again, I'm from Texas. All right, here you have a fantastic website. This is out of Japan. You can Google this right now, and you can see a simple hello world program written in JavaScript. Alert, hello, JavaScript. It actually turns it into all of the characters you see below. And if you look at that, that says 40,000 letters from those few hello world words. That's a lot of characters for a very short program. Now what happens, of course, when you get realistic, because this is what your JavaScript really looks like. I actually tried copying and pasting this exact JavaScript into this program, and it actually crashed my browser, which was surprising. So try writing a signature for this. It becomes very, very difficult. I can tell you this has been a challenge for the IPS world for quite a long time. There are some aspects of it that can be covered, but not all. Certainly not all. It's extremely difficult because the attackers have a lot of different methods here. All right. Now, there's no talk complete without picking on antivirus. While this talk is mainly about firewalls and IPS, we got to go there because it's fun. This is a simple DDoS tool. You can see evasions built in right into the bot builder panel. There are services, of course. You don't have to do any of this yourself. Just outsource it. For $20 per bot, you can have a crypter service that does all this for you. You can see here's a crypter with a zillion different options for how you can set up your malware to bypass antivirus. And of course, just to make sure it actually works, there are services that will tell you how effective they are. Right? The bad guys used VirusTotal just like you do. And here you can see, right, 1 out of a zillion different ones catch it. Right? So they can actually predict how successful their program's going to be. Right? So they can look at this. They can judge. How good am I going to be against your AV? How good am I going to be against your IPS? And of course, the firewall is easy because I know what port to go over. All right, again, you can Google any of this yourself. If you Google how to bypass AV, things pop up. I'm sure you're all familiar with Metasploit. There's a fantastic utility for Metasploit called Shikaraganai. Pretty much means in Japanese, you're screwed. And it's very effective at bypassing things like AV and IPS. It's extremely difficult, right? And that's what pen testers like Elizabeth use all over the place. I see people in the front smiling because they've used it. All right, other things that really make your life difficult as a signature writer. Legit JavaScript compression. Everybody uses JavaScript compression, right? All the streaming media. Google uses JavaScript like crazy. So not only do you have to look for what the bad guys are doing from an obfuscation standpoint, but the fact is JavaScript has obfuscation because that's how the language works, right? That's a feature. And that's a feature that's only gotten better and better over time. Of course, JavaScript is allowed in PDFs, all right? So then you you want to email someone something, you're one of these pen testers that has high success rate of phishing, you can put JavaScript in your PDF, the exact same, exploits we saw earlier. The PDFs can even have PNGs, of course, images. But the PNG isn't a PNG at all. It's an XFA form, and guess what? That includes JavaScript. So you have multiple layers inside of the PDF in order to hide your JavaScript. There's no way, as a networking device, moving at multi-gig speeds with no proxying capability, that you are going to catch this. Right? So what is your problem in 2014? Is it still Slammer? Funny enough, still around in some parts of the world. Or is it PDFs and Javas attached to email, or that somebody is clicking on? So ask yourself, why are you still using a technology that was built for a problem in the early 2000s? All right, to further that point, all right, early in the industry, we all talked about, well, we write signatures for the vulnerability, not the exploit. This had to do with, well, if you write one signature that's good for the vulnerability, all the various ways an attacker can craft the exploit won't matter. Well, that worked, again, great when you were going after things that were worm-based because you could actually see the vulnerability being triggered in the network traffic. Again, the moment you move to content, can't do it. Parsing those things, again, is very difficult and very slow. I mean, the performance goes down the crapper quick. So what a lot of vendors did was the only thing they could do, well, they start looking at more heuristic behavioral type signatures. Let's start looking at the exploits. It actually reversed. Some of your most effective signatures right now are not vulnerability-based. They are not going to have a CVE associated with them. That's actually the problem with IPS, is that it was meant for these vulnerabilities, and now, of course, compliance is asking you, or your boss is asking you, I read about this, Heartbleed vuln, or whatever the CVE of the day is, or Microsoft Super Tuesday. Do we have a signature for that so I can feel better, or we can check the box? You might have a signature for it, but when you get owned and you go back and say, why did the signature not trigger? That's the wrong question, right? Your vendor will give you an answer and it won't matter. What you should be asking is, did that signature ever trigger ever at all? I mean, like ever. Maybe in the world, right? You have signatures that flat out don't work. They just make you feel better. I mean, if you get owned, look it up. Check out the CVE. Look and see whether that signature ever fired. If there's a user group or a community that you can ask, whether it's open source or commercial IPS, ask a question. Anybody ever seen this signature fire? Tons of them have never fired. Guaranteed. Half the signatures you get every month from Microsoft Super Tuesday, I guarantee you'll never see fire, regardless of whether you're getting targeted by those attacks or not. I promise you that. All right, so signatures don't matter. It is not about how many signatures you have. It's not about how many signatures you have turned on. What you should be looking at is, do they ever actually fire? All right, moving into application detection, right? Because that's the new thing. Well, IPS isn't a standalone market anymore. We don't buy that standalone anymore. Now we've shoved IPS and firewall together, right? You take two crappy things and you put them together and it makes it better. You're still using the exact same technology, right? How do you do application detection? Deep packet inspection, a lot of signatures, a lot of deep parsing. It's the same thing. As a matter of fact, IPS was doing application detection before next-gen firewalls were, right? You just had to go actually find the signatures and turn them on. They weren't there by default, and they weren't wrapped into a fancy policy where you could manage them based on application. Right? So the issue is this actually opens up a new field because you are now whitelisting applications potentially. Right? The whole idea is you don't blacklist or whitelist, you graylist. What is the policy that we're going to allow? Well, if you whitelist an application, most of those next generation firewalls let all of that through. Well, what if there's a vulnerability in that application? You just let it through. So it's kind of moot. You've basically whitelisted the whole thing. You're now no longer looking for those attacks. Of course, you can make fun of all the naming criteria here, but I think the question for Elizabeth and I, and so many, has been, is this really a security issue? Right? When she's doing pen tests, is she using Facebook for those? Not generally, I would guess.
So that's kind of the big question about the NG firewalls. What is an NG firewall, right? What does it buy you? So when we're talking to people and they're talking about their security plan for the next 12 months, I think they actually think that an NG firewall will protect all layer 7 threats and minimize infections and things like that. And I'm like, actually, I think what it does is all the stuff that I really couldn't care less about. I don't care if people are out on Facebook. To me, all of the applications are really just an HR productivity issue. I just don't care. I care about the threats that are coming through those applications, absolutely. And do I think NG Firewall is the best technology to protect against those threats? Maybe not. Maybe not so much. So it's sort of this whole concept with the NG Firewall that it's buying you better security, and I don't think it is. I think it's buying you better control over your employees. So the other thing about IDSs, which I'm seeing, which I think is a big change from sort of the IPSs or IDSs of 15 years ago. 15 years ago, you can open up a policy, pretty much every product that was available, you were able to view your signatures, you were able to view details of your events. What I'm seeing predominantly, and I'll just pick on maybe the UTMs and some of the managed service or cloud-based services, you have no visibility into the product, right? So I feel like the management and the policy setting and the reporting has severely degraded over the past 15 years. There's so many products out there that have sort of turned into the set it and forget it. So my big joke is, well, if an IDS triggers in the woods and doesn't tell anyone, does it make a sound? I mean, I see so many products out there that it'll trigger an event and it tells you security event. You don't know what it is. You don't know what portion of the packet triggered the event. You don't know if it was part of a content filtering event or an IDS event. So I think that that's part of, for myself at least, when I'm trying to use IDSs, the challenge is, if I can't see what it's doing, how do I know it's working? And maybe I'm a control freak, but I need to know that, and I need to have visibility. In addition, a significant portion for me of the value in an IDS or IPS is being able to create custom signatures. So what I want to be able to do is, if I see some anomalous DNS traffic, I want to create a signature and I want to pick and choose to specific IPs and things like that. Well, guess what? A lot of these products, you can't adjust the policy. You can't create custom signatures. These are very scaled down versions of the technologies, and I feel it's just degraded the value of those products.
And you actually saw it in the market, right? In IDS, because you weren't in line, you could afford to do deep packet, meaning deeper packet, and you could actually provide context behind the event, right? You would have tons of little data as to why it triggered. Where, of course, when you went to the IPS world, you were blocking, so who cared? Well, the problem was, of course, then you didn't know why you were blocking, right? Because you couldn't go as deep as you wanted to, right? You triggered, you blocked, you moved on. Just because you're generating events, of course, as we all know now, doesn't make them exactly valuable.
And actually, there's a quote of the day, which I love: PCAP it or it didn't happen. So if I don't get a packet capture of the data portion of the packet or some portion, whatever triggered it, to me it didn't happen and it means nothing to me.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's take a walk down memory lane. I like this part because I get to pick on Dan a little bit. So let's talk 15, 20 years, let's just say when I started in the industry, maybe about 17 years ago, I worked at a 160,000 employee company and we were evaluating IDSs. At the time, the market was not even defined. So we had Symantec coming in and selling us vulnerability assessment programs as IDSs. This was back in the day. Symantec had bought like Layer 7, which is a technology or company that has long since gone away. But when I was out in the field and I was actually doing assessments and doing pen testing, those signatures that Dan was writing, they didn't work. They didn't stop me. There was not a single, and because we were an IDS vendor, our clients very often had our products running, and if they hired us to come in and do the testing on a quarterly basis or something like that, they had a pretty good security program and it had some really good visibility. Well, everything that I did to own their network, they could not detect it or stop it. We used to have cat and mouse games where at the end of the day, the only way that they could actually detect us is to put port control on the switches, right? So as soon as they saw us plug in and see a little bit of activity, they would physically come and find us. So why didn't they work that well? If we go back to the previous few slides looking at the threat landscape, they worked really well for the configure, for the code red, and the worms like that. Those, 5 to 10 really high threat, very prevalent type signatures that were using predefined, exploits that signatures could detect. Well, I was working in a production environment when I'm breaking into an environment. I can't run exploits against the domain controller. Are you crazy? I mean, the exploits did not, necessarily, they weren't in a production manner, meaning you ran the really good chance, if you ran an exploit against a domain controller, you're gonna bring down the domain controller. So we had to get creative and find different ways to break in, and in doing so, we had to sort of find the needles in the haystack and plug away. Well, the IDS, we just look like normal users. There's no amount of signatures that would be able to see us on an internal network. So I think that there's a big misconception that IDS and IPS worked great, at its inception 15 years ago, but guess what? It never worked that great. Nothing has changed. It's just that the threat landscape was smaller and it did detect those more prevalent attacks. Now we're in a different world, right? So we've got, much more many more attack vectors, many more infections and botnets, obfuscation and things like that are hindering the detection.
All right, so if any of you saw Rob's talk yesterday, he didn't have issues with these kinds of threat-based or networking-based technology stopping him. It was sneaky auditors that were busting him. All right,
it's the other technology. And the one thing I will say is the IDS and IPSs, they absolutely give you visibility. There's value in them, in those technologies. And I don't care what technology it is. Any technology that gives you visibility into the activity on your network, that has value, right? We all want to have eyes and ears. But with IDS, IPS specifically, I would ask you how much value?
So this brings us to the fundamental issue of course, you can't trust your vendor. You can only trust yourself, as Ice Cube told us on the album Predator. Who do I trust? Me. That's who. So what I'm seeing in the field, forgive me, maybe I'm a little bit jaded, but I talk to a lot of different clients, and there's a lot of lack of knowledge out there. So these are just a few examples
of what I've seen in the field. An example is a small healthcare clinic. They have it's a nonprofit, great organization, something around 15 to 20 clinics around the city. And they have a managed service that runs their firewall, which they always thought, oh, this managed provider, they take care of all of the security. And so they had an incident. It was an intentional malicious breach. And the IT dude called up the managed service provider because his account was locked out. And the service provider said, you know what, so's mine. Me too. I mean, come on. Huge misconception. They had no eyes and ears in the network. We really could not figure out what had occurred. There was no logging. None of those things were defined. And part of that, sure, shame on the client. But come on, it's a managed service provider. Do you mean to tell me that you don't even talk about saving logs? So that was one example. The other situation, can you go back one? Mm-hmm. The other situation was a small 500-employee company in the financial industry. They were sold UTMs by an integrator and literally told the CIO that this is everything you need, right? Because it's not all in one. That definition means everything you need. So they're like, why the hell do I keep getting infected? They didn't have any workstation hardening. They didn't have any other solutions in place, just that UTM was going to cure all for them. But then I see, of course, the larger companies, say a 10,000 person company, and in this situation, they had a serious malware problem. So they had something like, I want to say 10 reimages a day. So it was a big problem. They recognized those failures and they sort of cleaned it up. They did deploy IDS and IPS. I think one is running in true IPS mode and one is just in promiscuous. But they truly do get the value out of it. They use it for investigations. They use it for visibility. I can't say exactly what portion of their security budget they spent on it, but it wasn't a lot. And they do a lot of other things. And they're actually using it properly, and it was a good purchase, and it's working well. Then I have like a Fortune 1000 client that just spent 7 figures on IDS and IPS, and basically they're in a heavily audited or governed environment. They bought it for the auditors. And that just kind of makes me sick to my stomach. I don't know, they don't have the team to manage it. 7 figures, how much can we do with that much money for a security program, right? But they had to do it because the auditors said so. So that was definitely a compliance checkbox.
All right, so some of the things we would do. So of course, as you hear many times, do pay attention to H.D. Moore's Law. It is a pretty good indicator for, of course, what is out there and available to attackers. The IPS vendors do that, right? The third-party testers all do that. Not only do they use Metasploit, they also use, of course, things like Canvas, Core Impact. There's a company that actually supplies all these companies with both malware, vulnerability, and even signatures. So now the industry is getting so commoditized. Things are so, now rolled into one. You have price pressure. The technology, of course, is now actually getting worse because things are now being even outsourced at your vendor level, right? So this isn't, like I said, I wouldn't go now question or go beat up your vendor. They know all this stuff. It's a fundamental technology issue, and of course, at the end of the day, the way these things are deployed and used. So again, you have to look at what you're protecting and what might best protect it. Steve Werby, I think earlier today, had some very good examples as to how to do that. Outsourcing is one of those potential things. I've certainly seen outsourcing that was a good idea because, of course, you didn't have the resources, you didn't have the expertise, you didn't have the money. Sometimes that's a good idea. If your only reason for outsourcing is saving money, probably a bad idea. All right, so I would certainly avoid the, your mess for less because then you're just going to get a bunch of logs, and a bunch of logs doesn't really get you out of anything.
And these 2 bolded items up here, the measure success over time and measure failure constantly, those are 2 key messages I try to really drive home with my clients. And again, maybe I'm old and jaded, but we're not looking for utopia. And most of the organizations I'm working with, they're building a security program, right? So they're a little bit less mature. So my advice to them is to just constantly improve, right? Look to make improvements over a period of time. If you go into it trying to have utopian environment, you will fail. And then in terms of measuring that, first of all, measure whatever you can, right? Whatever statistics, data you can gather and collect and report on, that's great. And as you implement different technologies, monitoring, et cetera, I would expect that your reporting and your data would increase, right? So if you deploy more tools and more controls, you should see an increase in the incidents or events. And sort of like a bell curve, right? As you become more mature, there's going to be a period of time where you ramp up and you increase visibility, and you should see a lot of events, and that's a good thing. And your success should be measured by how many you see where success is an increase. And then over time, as you implement more controls and get more mature, the number of incidents and events you see should go down. But that's going to be a period of time,
whether
right?
Whether you've got an active deployment of an IDS IPS or whether you're looking at purchasing, and again, this doesn't matter if it's standalone or not, right? It doesn't matter if it's UTM or next-gen firewall, right? They're all doing the same thing. Measure the events you're getting, right? Look into those and see whether they're false positives or not. Look at your proof of concept. If you want to sit there and fire a couple things at it with Metasploit, you're not testing the capability of that technology at all. You need to test it in your real-world environment and measure that. If you do want to screw with the IPS vendor and use Metasploit, it's hilarious and awesome. All you have to do is change the exploit. Guaranteed you will bypass them. It's not an issue. They are writing exploit signatures today. It's all they can do. Don't blame them. But if you want to see a bypass, just go mess with the exploit a little bit. Throw a little JavaScript obfuscation in there. You'll scoot past them every single time. All right, you want my opinion? I think you heard it earlier today from others. Knock it off with this defense in depth crap. I generally hear that right from vendors with very broad portfolios that want you to buy more product. That's what it sounds like to me. Stop asking what your competition's doing. These ISACs are very, very useful and have helped with that level of ability, right? But did Target really care what TJ Maxx had done years ago? I mean, it doesn't matter, right? So many of these attacks are targeted at you, right? Being in line with where the rest of the industry is doesn't really help anything. Industry standards, as I mentioned, they're published. Everybody knows them, including the attackers. We all know compliance has now been proven to be near useless. And at the end of the day, I think if either one of us were CISOs, your job time is a ticking clock. The first person to get fired is the CISO. That happens all the time, right? Whether the company's stock price is affected or their brand reputation is affected, your job is affected, right? So you buying, especially from these large companies where that used to be the safe move, right? That's no longer buying job security. That's going to produce what's called a resume generating event. And your IDS does not have a signature for that.
So I'm just going to tell Dan to shut up. It all still works. So what frustrates me quite often, let's just refer back to my previous case study with the client that just cannot stop getting infected. Don't ask me why your firewall doesn't block an auto-run infection. Go disable auto-run on your workstations. I mean, come on. Defense in depth works. Mubix's talk yesterday about talking about using proxy servers and canary accounts. There's all types of creative ways that you can implement controls at different layers. So defense in depth still works.
Just don't think defense in depth means firewall IPS-AV anymore.
No.
All right, which is exactly what people continue to buy. UTMs, that's exactly what they are. Next-gen firewall, at the end of the day, really all that is an enterprise-grade UTM. All right, you're shoving a bunch of technology into one thing, and when you do that, things suffer. You're no longer good at any one thing. You're mediocre at a bunch of stuff. And performance is hugely affected. SSL is a great example. Oh, you want SSL on your security device? Good luck when you actually turn it on. You might gain a little bit more visibility. I'd measure that. But your performance is going to suffer incredibly.
So the good vendors, I talk to all of them. It's exhausting. The good vendors that sell technologies that do multiple things, they will be honest with you and tell you. Maybe it's me because I'm a partner and they feel like they can be more honest than they are with the clients, but a good vendor will tell you precisely what the box is designed to do. The resellers or maybe certain salespeople or certain characters in the mix, they may not understand that. And they may be overselling these technologies. So you just have to be careful about that and always ask the question and keep probing if you don't feel like you've gotten a good answer. I'm not saying people are being dishonest. I'm just saying they may not have the knowledge.
And
so if you hear, should we say it together?
if you hear the words, this is all you need.
Run.
Shikaraganai. All right, so really what would we do? Again, your technology does not have a signature for when security fails, right? So I'm with Elizabeth. If you can packet capture everything, man, there's a lot of technologies and just human power that, of course, can really dig into things deeper. There's just so much more that you can do. Really, PCI gives you compensating controls for all these, issues that they think might be solved with these legacy technologies. What you really want is a compensating control for all those stupid compensating controls you have to deploy.
So most of what I see the most effective security programs are those that implement controls and technologies to plan for the other technologies and controls to fail, right? So my content filtering will catch what my IDS and IPS doesn't. My IDS and IPS will catch what my firewall doesn't. My endpoint will catch, not much, but something, right? Macroviruses maybe. So, but in short, these solutions, each one of them all have value. How much is questionable, but plan for and implement your controls for all the other controls to fail. It's not a, negative lifestyle to live. It's just kind of smart planning and designing, I think.
So thank you very much. I don't think we have any time for questions, but we'll be around for a few more minutes here. And of course, you can always abuse us on Twitter. That's what it's for. Thank you.
Thank you.